This is going to be a coaching video for those who would be leading, facilitating an on-campus small group that meets on Sunday, November the 8th. So if that's you, you're got the right video that hopefully can give you some things that can help you as you prepare to do that this coming Sunday. So let's go ahead and print out the lesson manuscript. If you haven't done that already, you should have had that as an attachment with the email with this video link. Go ahead and get that in front of you. Grab your Bible. And we're just going to kind of walk through and see if we can suggest some things that might help you, and also give you some other some resources perhaps that will be of some assistance as you get ready to prepare to lead your group. I think you'll agree with me that Sunday we had a great start to this new series we're calling the Lord's Prayers, as we're looking at some of the prayers that Jesus prayed and investigating those and looking into those in regards to how they relate to us and our relationship with God, and as we've said earlier, our relationship with each other. And Sunday was a great time of celebration together, just the teaching of the scriptures, the celebrating the Lord's Supper, having the parent-child dedication time. It's just a really good day. And even despite all of the rain that was coming down, we had a great time together, and just a neat time of being together, gathering as a community of believers to worship God and prepare to carry out His mission. So glad you were part of that, and look forward to this Sunday as well. Now, this Sunday we're going to be looking at another prayer of Jesus, and it's going to be a prayer that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we'll be looking at into that, and especially how it relates into following God and doing His will. And there on page 1, you get a little bit of a lesson overview that kind of gets you pointed in that direction there. On page 2 of the manuscript is your introduction, and in that we talk about some of the things I've just mentioned. Remember, the introduction is there for you to help you transition your group from your initial gathering, getting time, just enjoying one another, and moving into a studying of the text together. For those of you that will be meeting during the 10:30 hour, your transition might simply be, hey, let's kind of highlight some of the things that we picked up from Brett's message this morning and use that to kind of give you a segue into the teaching the text. Now, on page 3 is where we move into teaching the text. And this week, our text is going to come from an Old Testament book, the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 6. And we're going to be looking there at the first 7 verses. But to be able to kind of get a grasp of what those verses, how the significance of those verses and what happens there, you need to go ahead and read through the chapter 6 in its entirety, paying a special attention to verses 8 through 13, because you find out there that what Isaiah is going to wrestle with a little bit in following God, that the results of that were that he had a very difficult assignment, and that he carried that assignment out. And even with that difficult assignment, he was willing to say yes to God's will. And this page 3 in teaching the text, as it gets ready to get you moving into the passage itself, it's important to get that background, to have that to refer to as you move into these first 6 verses. So for your benefit as a leader, facilitator, teacher, I would encourage you to spend some time on those verses, get a grasp of what it was that that Isaiah was doing and following God's will, but also the circumstances surrounding carrying that out. That will make these first 7 verses even have much of a more significance for you and for your group. All right. On page 4 is we get into the text, and these verses again can be some verses like the Psalm that we looked at last week that are well known to many of us, and because of that, there's a tendency to kind of slide through them. But again, I just caution you, take your own time, read through this several times to get yourself prepared and to help your group walk through these verses so that you glean from them, gather from them the truth that God has for us. Okay? Now, we're basically going to look at several points, teaching points throughout this lesson. In fact, there is going to be 3 of those. And as we look through those, we're going to break that passage down to around these 3 teaching points. The first teaching point is that, number 1, God has perfect timing. And what we're talking about there is how God always moves in our lives, and He moves in the circumstances and situations of the world around us in a perfect way, in a perfect timed way. You remember that in Galatians, there it even says in chapter 4 that God sent His Son into the world at just the right time. God's timing is always perfect because he is a perfect God. And the background of this help, and when you begin to look at the background of when Isaiah received his word from God, and you will see that how the timing of that played into that, and how God used the timing of what was happening around Isaiah and in his world in sending him and giving him this word that he had for him there in those first 6-7 verses. Now, the background centers around there because it talks about the time in which Isaiah received his message from God, and it was the time of Uzziah's death, who was the king of Judah at that time. Now, what I would encourage you to do is go back and look in 2 Chronicles, read 2 Chronicles 26 through 31, because they record for us the time of the kings during which Isaiah ministered, in which time in which he prophesied, and the time in which he carried out the assignment that God gave him. And I think it would be helpful for you to go back and read through those chapters, chapter 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, because that is the same time period, those kings that ruled, is the same time period in which Isaiah was ministering. And you will see as you read through there some of the context in which he was carrying out the assignment that God had for him, the type of kings, and the result of their leadership, what happened to what the people were at that time in that way. Now, it's interesting here, just one note, and I would just kind of a curious thing call out to you, that in your manuscript it does point out that Isaiah obviously had access into the different courts of the kings during the time that he ministered. So that it seemed that he had some connection there. Jewish history and it seems to indicate that Isaiah may have been actually had some royal blood in his own veins, and there is an indication that Isaiah and Uzziah were actually related. They might have been cousins, and that kind of gave a background for him having access. Now, the time in which Isaiah carries out this assignment is a time of personal, emotional instability around the people because the King Uzziah has died. Other kings are coming into play, and there's not really a certainty of what's going to happen to the nation under this new leadership. And so that kind of sets the scene, so to speak, for what's getting ready to happen in these next verses. Teaching point number 2 is because obviously we're talking about trusting God here. We can trust him because his timing is always perfect. Secondly, we can trust him because God is perfectly holy. And as you read through those first 3 verses there, you will see the stress of the holiness of God. And I think our manuscript does a good illustration, or gives us a good illustration for how we come into contact with that. You kind of get the bird's eye view of things, and see the big picture. And it can be overwhelming, but when you get close, when you move real close, then you begin to see how overwhelming the individual aspects of that big picture are. And in this case, as Isaiah gets a vision, and he gets a close-up vision of God, he begins to see how holy God is, and that's going to affect how he sees himself. He gets really up and personal with God, and that helps him then begin to not only see who God is, it begins for him to see who he is as well. Notice at the bottom there of page 5, it asks the question, how would you define or describe the word holy? And again, that's sometimes a difficult thing for us to do. There is a good reference in there in regards to how Brett has described that for us in days gone by. Altogether different, altogether other. And God is holy, he's altogether other from anything or anyone else. And this sets him apart as God and as only God. And one of the things that, if you go over to page 6, you get into the continuing discussion of this holy, the God being holy. And one of the things that helps us maybe in that is noticing the response there of the angels who Isaiah has a vision of as he's looking or seeing what God is revealing to him. And it talks about he's in the throne room of God, and these these angels or these seraphims that are there around the throne of God. And it says that they covered their eyes, or covered their faces, excuse me. They covered their feet. They had 3 sets of wings, and then they flew with the other third pair of wings. And when we think about that, covering the face, covering the feet, are indications of how they were overwhelmed at the holiness of God. These angelic beings, that their natural response was to cover their faces because of God's holiness, the brightness and glory of God. Cover their feet in a sense of recognizing who God is and his holiness. Then they also used the 3rd set of wings as they flew, ready to carry out God's purposes there. There's a question that's asked there about in relationship to what the angels were singing and are stating over and over again, and they just simply used a trilogy of holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory, and they just kept doing that, holy, 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 over and over again. The question asked, how could you do that throughout all eternity without getting bored? What does that tell us? And as you see, there's an answer, a suggestion of an answer there. Basically, what it tells us is that the holiness of God is really indescribable, and it is limitless, so that they could keep singing that over and over and over again, because they were getting more and more and more aware of how holy God is, and his holiness is limitless. So there was a never-ending revelation that was coming to them concerning the holiness of God. Now we move into finally, or to the 3rd teaching point there, that God shows us perfect mercy. Now think about this. The timing of God, when it happened at just the right time, obviously in Isaiah's situation during the death of King Uzziah, in the context of his own time and of what was happening with the people that he would be delivering his message to. He's made aware of the holiness of God, and he sees who God is and his perfect altogether other. And then now we have the response, because see, when Isaiah comes and realizes who God is, as I said before, he begins to see who he is, and he realizes that he is in trouble. He's in deep trouble, because seeing the holiness of God revealed to him who he is and the desperate need that he is, how unholy he is, his own depravity. Because when we see God for who he is, we're going to see ourselves for who we are, and it's going to point out to us the need that we have in our life. You see, when Isaiah came into contact with the holiness of God, it exposed Isaiah for who he is, and he recognized he was in a bad place. He's in a bad place because of who he is compared to who God is there. And now notice what happens though. Instead of Isaiah being consumed by the holiness of God, the result is he becomes cleansed by God, cleansed of his sin. It says one of the angels goes, takes a coal from the altar and touches his lips in a symbolic way of cleansing him of his sin. It's interesting he chose the lips, because I think every one of us would probably have to say, you know what, I'm in bad shape there. There are things I've said, the way I've said them and so forth makes me guilty. I often wonder if he chose the lips there because all of us would say, yep, guilty there. And so he does that with Isaiah, but also he cleanses his lips because of the mission that he's going to give Isaiah. He's to be a messenger for God. So he cleanses his lips in that way of preparing him for what God has for him to do. And he goes to the altar. Altar was a place where sacrifice was to take place. And that helps us understand that all sin is forgiven based on sacrifice. In fact, you go back to look at Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, and it says there that without blood being shed, there's no basis for forgiveness. There has the altar. There had to be a sacrifice offered. And Hebrews 9:22 is the New Testament reminder of that, taking that from 17:11, which Leviticus was a Levitical law, and talking about the sacrifices that God had for the people of Israel, and then how Jesus himself carried that sacrifice out ultimately by his death on the cross. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 18, it would be worth you pausing here and going and reading through that and following up on what we're talking about here in the sense of the sacrifice. Without sacrifice, there can be no forgiveness. And Jesus himself is the one who became our sacrifice for sin. He died on a cross for us, shed his blood there so forgiveness could be applied to us. And it's interesting here when you look at what happened to Isaiah. The hot coal, that hot coal, instead of burning him, hurting him, that hot coal was used by God to bring healing to him and to put him in a place to be used by God. And it's oftentimes in the moment of our greatest need that God's grace and mercy pours into our lives. And that's exactly what happened here to Isaiah. Now look over on page 7 and continue this discussion of teaching the text in this last teaching point. And I want you to notice something here, because we see the mercy and grace of God at work, because God asked for a volunteer to serve him. Who can I send, he says. And God would send someone. That's the sovereignty. There's a connection here between the sovereignty of God and the human response to God's sovereignty. God's going to send someone. That's his sovereignty. He's going to send out a messenger. But he asked the question, who could I send? That someone that he would send would need to be willing. And that's the human response. And Isaiah obviously said, here I am, send me. See, God's grace cleansed him. And when he came into contact, the holiness of God revealed to Isaiah who he is, his desperate need of a Savior. When God's grace and mercy poured into his life, that motivated him, being cleansed and made right with God, being brought, reconciled in a right relationship with God. That motivated him to volunteer and say, God, I'm willing. I'll follow your will. I'll carry out the purpose that you have for me. And it's interesting to note here too that the reconciliation that God brings in the cleansing of sin that God does in Isaiah's life is done so that he can carry out the mission that God has for him. And that's an important point that's made here in your text or your transcript there, is that God has a purpose for each and every one of us. As you've heard it said before, if you've been around church life very long, God didn't save us so we could sit, soak, and sour. He saved us because he has a mission. He has a purpose for us to be involved in. And he has chosen to do that, work through us despite who we are, because his grace and mercy flows into us as it cleanses us and makes and prepares us then to carry out what God has for us to do. The bottom of page 7 is a good summary there of what we've been talking about and why we should trust God. And it's a good way to wrap up that your discussion there. And page 8 kind of highlights that and pointing out that trusting God is basically the faith that we put in God. Those two things obviously are one and the same. We trust God. We have faith in God. Our faith is simply trusting God that he has perfect timing, that God is holy, so that makes him perfectly right, the altogether other one. And because he is holy, we trust him, and he shows us grace and mercy in that way. Page 9 talks about your application moment. Page 11 is your small group handout that you'll use in that application moment. As always, encourage you take advantage of that. And then page 8 is a conclusion to wrap up with this week's memory verse. Hopefully this can help you. Kind of a lot of material, even though it's 7 verses, boy, it's a lot of things to consider. And so I think one of the challenges you might have this week is how to boil all of this down to fit into the time frame that you have with your on-campus small group discussion. So use some of the background information we've suggested, some of the cross-referenced verses, and then I just encourage you to glean out of that those things that you can highlight and you can use to prompt your group into thinking through these truths that come out of Isaiah 6, 1 through 7 there. So have a great time together. Thank you for what you do in leading, facilitating that on-campus small group. And as you know, this is what God uses, we believe, to help each and every one of us become disciples of Jesus. God bless.
In the morning as I rise, may your hope lift up my eyes. If I may wake to troubles deep, I am at peace, secure in thee. Have your way, Lord, have your way. In my heart your kingdom make. As I walk, each step I take, one thing I pray, Lord, have your way. On streets of joy, in brightest day, by your Spirit have your way. And if the night around me falls, yet I will follow at your call. Have your way, Lord, have your way. In my heart your kingdom make. As I walk, each step I take, oh, this I pray, Lord, have your way. When the hour has come to pass, and I am found with you at last, then I will join in heaven's praise. Hallelujah.